Thanks, Anthony. Those are some pretty interesting stories. If you want to learn more about them, go to lawandcrime.com to read all about them, including the Bella Bond case, which we covered and was a really, really tragic case. We're going to switch gears, though. We're going to go back into the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. Now, we have a live feed. This is the sentencing hearing for that serial killer who was convicted of 2 counts of murder and 1 count of raping a woman, kidnapping a woman as well. So he was found guilty across the board, multiple counts of kidnapping, rape, murder. I want to bring in real quick my guest, Law&Crime trial analyst Yosha Gunasekera. Yosha, good to see you.
Good to be here.
So let's talk a little bit about what we can expect today. Mr. Grate was found guilty across the board of 23 counts, including multiple counts of aggravated murder, rape, kidnapping. He could face the death penalty. How does that work? What is the prosecution going to argue, and what is the defense going to argue?
So at the sentencing phase, you're going to hear the defense try to put on expert witnesses, I believe in this case, a neuropsychologist, to say that Shawn Grate had a lot of issues. He was mentally ill, and because he was mentally ill, that's mitigating evidence, and he should not be given the death penalty. Of course, you're going to hear from the prosecution, who's going to say that he committed these terrible acts, he was found guilty, and he knew exactly what he was doing.
You think that's going to work? They're saying that he had suffered from a mental disease or defect?
No, I don't think it's going to work. I think the facts of this case are so egregious. There's multiple women. He's spoken to the police. He's detailed his crimes.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big factor. He confessed to the police, which is something the jury definitely heard. The rundown, what we expect is going to happen here, as Yosha said, we're going to hear from the psychiatrist, probably Dr. John Fabian for the defense, then family members. We're anticipating that the jury deliberations will begin later, and then the jury will send them home. If they eventually do not, if they do not come up with a verdict, they'll come back the next day. Here's what we're going to do right now in order to prepare for this case. Anybody who followed it, the way that police first learned about Mr. Grate and they found these decomposed bodies of the victims and Jane Doe was able to make a 911 phone call from this house. This is a woman who was kidnapped and raped, and she was able to free herself and make a 911 phone call. We have that 911 phone call for you right now. Let's play that. You want to talk about reality, folks? It doesn't get any more real than that. That is that 911 phone call in the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. So again, Shawn Grate was found guilty of multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, rape. Jane Doe was one of those victims. She was able to escape the house, call 911, and they rushed in and arrested Mr. Grate and saved Jane Doe. And that's when they found the 2 decomposed bodies of Elizabeth Griffith and Stacey Stanley. We have a live feed right now in the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. This is the sentencing phase. What will the jury determine? Life in prison or the death penalty? Let's go live. You're listening to a live feed and watching a live feed there in the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. So Shawn Grate, who was convicted of multiple counts of murder, rape, and kidnapping, is now facing a sentencing hearing. That same jury that convicted him has to decide what will happen to him. As the judge is speaking to the jury, there are 4 options. Either they can choose 30 years to life in prison, 25 years to life in prison without the possibility of parole, or the death penalty. That is what is at stake for Mr. Grate. And the prosecution and the defense will battle it out, saying these are the aggravating factors about why he deserves the death penalty, and these are the mitigating factors about why he does not deserve the most severe punishment. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be back in the Shawn Grate case. Welcome back, everybody. I'm your host, Jesse Weber, here on the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio. We're covering the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. Mr. Grate was found guilty by a jury of his peers for multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and rape, as well as several other crimes in connection with the deaths of 2 women and the abduction and rape of a 3rd unidentified woman. What is happening right now is the sentencing hearing. That same jury that convicted him has to determine what his sentence will be. Will he get 30 years in prison, 30 years to life in prison, 25 years to life in prison without the possibility of parole, or the death penalty? That's right. That is on the table here in Ohio. Now, we have a live feed. We're going to jump into it in a minute. Before we do, I want to quickly bring on Law and Crime trial analyst Yosha Gunasekera. Yosha, just if you could explain to our viewers and our listeners real quick, The judge quickly decided these. The judge decided these these sexual violent predator specifications. What does that mean in relation to this case?
So when the judge deems someone a violent predator and puts this specification on a certain count, it essentially means that the jury can find Shawn Grate guilty and of the death penalty. So they can sentence him to the death penalty. Without these specifications, it would just be up to life in prison. So this puts death penalty on the table.
Well, that's an advantage for the prosecution. Let's listen in. The prosecution is delivering their opening statement. All right, everybody, if you're listening live right now to the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio, that was the prosecution's opening statement in the sentencing phases, which we're covering right now. The defense opted to waive their opening statement, and as you heard in the prosecution, this man, Shawn Grate, you convicted him of the murders of Stacey Hicks, or Stacey Stanley, and Elizabeth Griffith, and because of those aggravated murders, you should find the defendant eligible for the death penalty. So we're going to listen back in when they have a new witness on the stand. I want to bring in real quick criminal defense attorney Yosha Gunasekera. Yosha, that was a surprise. The defense waived their opening statement. What do you think is going on here?
Well, remember, the burden of proof is completely on the prosecution. So the prosecution has to prove that he deserves the death penalty, not the defense. The defense is likely going to let their witnesses come in and then close on what their witnesses present.
So do you think that after they're going to put on, I know that the defense is going to put on a psychologist named Dr. John Fabian to explain the mental makeup of the defendant. Do you think after they do that and after they put on their case, they're eventually going to have a statement to the jury?
Yes, they'll have a closing, and the closing is likely going to summarize what the witnesses say on the stand and then make the argument for why Shawn Grate doesn't deserve the death penalty.
If they find him eligible for the death penalty, how does it work? What happens then?
Well, then it's in the judge's hands. The judge then takes that, and then there's post-sentencing proceedings. Obviously, there could be appeals. There could be a lot of different things that happen. So Shawn Grate is not going to be sentenced to death anytime this year or possibly for the next several years as his case is pending appeal.
Isn't it a misconception? People think that when someone is sentenced to death, they're going to get killed in 6 months. It could take years.
It's a misconception. Some people are on death row for decades.
And that might be what happens here. For all of our listeners here on Sirius XM Radio, Channel 109, first of all, thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Law&Crime Network. What we're looking at right now is a live feed into the courtroom. There's a shot of Shawn Grate in between his two attorneys. Hard to tell what he's thinking as you're seeing this. He was already convicted. But, Yosha, we're not so surprised when he was already, he pled guilty during the middle of the trial to 15 of the 23 charges. When you heard that, and he still tried, after that he tried to fight the murder charges, but pleading guilty to 15 of the 23 charges. What did you make of that?
I thought it was significant. It apparently appeared to be based on what Shawn Grate wanted and not what his attorneys wanted. And it sealed his fate that he was definitely going to die in prison. He was going to spend the rest of his life in prison. The remaining counts that the jury found him guilty on, now that's where we're trying to decide whether he'll actually be sent to death row and eventually die by lethal injection.
For anybody joining us, this is a really disturbing set of details. The police found the decomposed bodies of the victims, Elizabeth Griffith and Stacey Stanley or Stacey Hicks. And they saw, I mean, this is a house of horrors. It was a decrepit house, and this young woman, Jane Doe, who has not been identified, she testified in this case. That was really heart-wrenching testimony to hear that. And, I mean, the jurors heard from the victim herself. What did you make of that testimony when the victim herself, the one who was kidnapped and raped repeatedly, and she described it in detail, raped repeatedly by the defendant, what did you think of her testimony?
It's extremely powerful. Even hearing that 911 call that she made that we heard earlier, it's just terrifying because not only did he commit acts of violence against these women, he literally chained them up in his house and left them there and repeatedly brutalized them. And that's going to be the factors that are weighing on the jury's mind as they make this, critical decision.
I don't think it's hard to determine what the aggravating factors are. So what are the mitigating factors? Do you think that it's enough to say, look, And there was some controversy. If anybody was reading about this case, Dr. John Fabian, didn't he want the court to pay more money for certain fees to get like other kinds of procedures done on Mr. Grate's mind? I mean, can you explain that a little bit? He asked the court, he recommended to the defense attorneys, you should ask the court for more money to get a certain scan of the defendant's brain?
Yes, he wanted the defense attorneys to hire another expert to look at brain scans and to introduce this, what he said was cutting-edge technology that would provide more information to the mental state of Shawn Grate. And so that's delayed proceedings. That's why you've seen the break. The end of this trial was a few weeks ago, and now we're not seeing sentencing until now. Part of that is because of Dr. Fabian's recommendation. Let
me get this straight. Let's clarify this. In other words, if he were to suffer from some sort of mental disease or defect, then it's not his fault? Is that the way to say it? It's not his fault and he shouldn't be sentenced to death?
No, it's not necessarily that it's not his fault. It's just that it's a mitigating circumstance. It's something that the jurors can consider as a factor to why he shouldn't be sentenced to death.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it'll work. We'll have to see. As we wait for the live feed to come back in the courtroom, here's what we're going to do. There was we talked about, Jane Doe called 911. She escaped. She's the hero of this case because she alerted police to what was happening with Mr. Grate. We have a short report by our very own Rachel Stockman, editor-in-chief here at Law&Crime. I want to play you that report, and it can give you a better analysis of her testimony and how it fits into this case. Take a look.
The surviving victim who escaped from a suspected serial killer by calling the police while he slept took the stand. The unidentified victim described how she first met with the defendant, Shawn Grate, who is accused of kidnapping and sexually assaulting her and is charged in connection with the murders of 2 other women.
What's the problem? I've been abducted. Who abducted you? Shawn Grate. Where's she at now? Asleep.
She claimed Grate was like an older brother to her before he snapped.
So when he started pulling the Bible from my hands, I just looked up like curious, like, what are you doing? And that's when he said, you're not going anywhere. I tried to push him away and get up. I was just doing everything. Trying to kick, punch, but everything I did, he just did it so much harder. I think when I stopped struggling and fighting, he asked me if I had enough, and I think I just remained motionless, and so he released his hands. He started pulling off my clothes.
The victim described the assault she endured at the hands of the defendant.
At some point on the night of the 11th, were you sexually assaulted?
Several times.
How were you assaulted?
In every way imaginable.
Grate faces 23 counts, including aggravated murder and kidnapping. If convicted, he could face the death penalty. For Law&Crime, I'm Rachel Stockman.
What a horrifying, horrifying account from the surviving victim in the Shawn Grate case. Welcome back to the Law&Crime Network and Law&Crime on Sirius XM Radio. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We are covering the live feed right now in the Shawn Grate case. This is the sentencing hearing. Mr. Grate was convicted not only in the kidnapping and rape of that young woman who you just heard, but also the kidnapping, murder, and one rape of 2 women, Elizabeth Griffith and Stacey Stanley. Now, their decomposed bodies were found in a decrepit house that he was living in, that he captured them in, that he had sexually abused them in, and that he brought them back to and ultimately murdered them in. It was a really chilling account in that case. And now, after convicting him, that same jury, the same jury that convicted him on multiple counts of murder and kidnapping and rape, now have to determine what will happen to him. And that means it's possible they will opt for the death penalty. That's right, Mr. Grate. For all of our viewers, that's a live feed. You're seeing Mr. Grate right there. He could face the death penalty. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about it before we go into the live feed again. I want to bring back in Yosha Gunasekera. This is a bizarre case in the fact that he admitted to a lot of the crimes. He admitted to doing a lot of this. Not only that, we just learned this past week that his testimony, not his testimony, his statements to police about killing another woman are being used against him now. Can you explain that?
So those additional statements that he made that didn't come into the initial trial, they came into a separate hearing that the judge had. So once in the middle of the trial, he pled guilty to all those counts. Then the judge held a separate hearing to decide some of those sexually aggravating factors. And that's where some of this additional information came in. And those details were especially disturbing.
So what we learned this past week is he told a detective earlier on in the case that he raped a prostitute. Did I read that correctly? He raped a prostitute. And I want to make sure I say this the right way. It's alleged that he said that he was doing this as a tax collector. He said that since she doesn't pay tax, he was doing this. I'm not sure I understand that.
I mean, it doesn't make sense. That's why I don't understand it. It's disgusting. He raped a prostitute and said because prostitutes don't pay taxes, because technically their work is illegal, sex work is illegal in many states, that he was then taking his tax from her. It makes no sense. It's disgusting and it's disturbing, and it's certainly not helping as his case moves forward.
You know what's interesting about this case is you try to find a pattern. He is a serial killer, okay? He's a serial predator of women. And you try to find a pattern between the two women that he killed, the woman that he abducted and raped, and now this prostitute. Didn't you get the sense that he was trying to be, like he was self-righteous? Trying to help them, trying to protect them, trying to do I mean, he befriended women who needed help at certain times. They were religious at times. One woman at least was mental. She was not I think she had a low IQ of some kind. So it's interesting. Like, can you explain his pattern a little bit?
Well, he's preying on women that are especially vulnerable, which makes it all the more disgusting. And it's probably why he's gotten away with this for so long. He found women who maybe were isolated from their communities and then attacked them. And it's just a very disturbing chain of events. But he has expressed that he would even potentially be interested in sexually violating minors. So I don't know if he even has a pattern.
Yeah.
He essentially just wants to go after vulnerable people, apparently of any type.
Let's talk about that when we come back from our break. The fact that Mr. Grate admitted, as Yosha just said, he has a sexual attraction to minors, which is not good in a case where we have to determine, well, when the jury has to determine what should ultimately happen to him. Again, this is the sentencing phase in the Shawn Grate case. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Law&Crime, everybody. You're listening to a live feed and watching a live feed in the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. Again, Mr. Grate was convicted by this jury that's listening to everything you're listening to right now. This jury convicted him of 2 counts of aggravated murder as well as the kidnapping and rape of a third unidentified woman. What you're listening to right now, this is his sentencing phase. This is his sentencing hearing. That same jury has to determine what his sentence will ultimately be. And the harshest sentence he could receive is the death penalty. I'm here with Yosha Gunasekera, our Law&Crime trial analyst. We're learning from, right now on the stand, is the defendant's sister, talking about what their mother went through. The mother's grandparents, I mean, they had a violent relationship. The grandmother shot the grandfather. How does this play into the Shawn Grate case?
Again, it's to garner sympathy for Shawn Grate, and it's to better understand why Shawn Grate turned out the way he did. And often family history and abuse is a factor in that.
We'll have to see if it ultimately works. Let's go back live into the courtroom again. This is the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio.
We did.
You're listening and watching to a live feed in the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. Welcome back to the Law&Crime Network and Law&Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. Shawn Grate is a convicted serial killer, a man who was convicted by a jury of his peers of murdering Elizabeth Griffith and Stacey Hicks, as well as kidnapping and raping a third unidentified woman, well, a woman who has chosen to be unidentified. We refer to her as Jane Doe. After convicting him, now that same jury has to determine what his punishment will be, and he could face the death penalty. What's happening right now is the defense is putting on a series of witnesses for mitigating circumstances, saying, in light of all the factors, this is why our client should not be sentenced to death. On the stand right now is the defendant's sister. I want to bring back in Law&Crime trial analyst Yosha Gunasekera. What did we learn? We learned that he had a tough upbringing. His grandparents were extremely violent. His grandmother shot his grandfather. He himself had problems when he was younger, learning disabilities. He had a tumor in his arm at one point. It shattered all of his dreams of becoming an athlete. But does this excuse criminal behavior? What do you make of this?
So I think we're still just getting into the beginning. I think the sister is going to be on the stand for a while, and I think she's going to paint a very detailed picture. She obviously is 8 years older than him and is able to remember some of these events from when he was a child that he probably doesn't even remember himself. And she has an amazing memory. She's really calling upon these specific details. So I think what we're hearing now is just the beginning of what likely is going to be a tale about Shawn Grate's difficult life.
It's interesting to listen to and watch. We have to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to go live into the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. Stay tuned. Well, hello there, everybody. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We're covering the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. This actually, I shouldn't even say accused, this convicted serial killer, a man who was convicted of the murders of two women, Elizabeth Griffith and Stacey Hicks, as well as the abduction and rape of a third woman who's only been identified as Jane Doe. After finding him guilty across the board of numerous crimes, including aggravated murder, kidnapping, rape, tampering with evidence, all these different sorts of crimes in a 23-count indictment, that same jury that convicted Mr. Grate now has to determine what his punishment will be. The prosecution and the defense are battling it out, saying these are the aggravating circumstances of this case, these are the mitigating circumstances. And why are they doing this? Because the death penalty is on the table because of those two murders. That's right, Shawn Grate, the defendant, could be eligible for the death penalty. What we're looking at is a live feed right now into that courtroom. Before we hit our break, on the stand is the defendant's sister, explaining a little bit more about Shawn Grate's childhood and what made him the man he is today. It should be noted for all of our listeners on Sirius XM Radio, Shawn Grate got a little emotional when his sister was speaking, and it's the first time we've seen any emotion from the defendant. Let's go live into the courtroom. There's a sidebar right there in the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius Radio, channel 109. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. Shawn Grate, a convicted murderer, a convicted serial killer, now faces his sentencing hearing. What will his sentence ultimately be? Could it be the death penalty? Possibly, considering the fact that Mr. Grate was convicted of some very serious crimes and aggravated murder. On the stand right now is his sister, Barbara Charter, and she is talking about what Shawn Grate was like as a kid, what his upbringing was. What you just heard, what the objection was about a fire burning down their house. I want to bring back in law and crime trial analyst Yosha Gunasekera. Now, I am not a betting man, but if I was, I would say something that fire may or may not have probably was started by Shawn Grate. That's why they're asking about it, right?
I think that is a very reasonable inference. He was likely the fire starter.
How does a jury dissect this from a bad kid? Everybody goes through things in their life to, you know what, this explains a lot of his behavior.
So the prosecution, this is where the prosecution comes in. They're going to say, yes, it's sad that these things happened to Shawn Grate, but bad things happen to people everywhere, and they don't go and kill women. So you're going to hear from the prosecution. Right now, we're just hearing from the defense and the defense's side. Right,
and the defense is asking all of these questions to try to get mitigating circumstances, sympathy from the jury, trying to understand why he is the way he is so that they will eventually vote not in favor of the death penalty. Let's go back live into the courtroom. Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We're listening to the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio and watching it live as well. This is the case about a convicted serial killer, a man who was convicted of murdering two women and abducting and raping a third. This is his sentencing hearing. The same jury that convicted him across the board in that 23-count indictment now has to determine what his sentence should be. And the death penalty is on the table. The defense is presenting mitigating circumstances, mitigating factors, which you just heard from the defendant's sister, talking about his tough upbringing, talking about the problems he went through, the issues he suffered through, how he didn't come from a loving household, how he suffered a tumor in his arm, and all of these different things. Now, will it be enough to convince a jury that maybe we should have some sympathy on this defendant and not vote in favor of the death penalty? Maybe. We'll have to see. That witness, this sister, is about to be grilled under cross-examination by the prosecution. Let's go live. You're listening and watching a live feed in the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. Welcome back to Law and Crime. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. We have to take a quick break, but we're going to jump back into this exciting case because it's really a disturbing one, but an important one. Shawn Grate is a convicted murderer. He was convicted of killing 2 women and abducting and raping a third. Now what's happening is that same jury that convicted him has to determine what he should be sentenced to. That's what this is, his sentencing phase. And what you're listening to is the testimony of Barbara Charter, who is the defendant's sister. And she's explaining a little bit more of Shawn Grate's upbringing. And the reason this is all important is because the death penalty is on the table. So the defense will do whatever they can to try to garner some sympathy from the jury. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in a minute. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Jesse Weber, your host here on the Law and Crime Network and Law and Crime on Sirius XM Radio, channel 109. We are playing for you right now. This is a live feed into the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio. Shawn Grate is a convicted murderer, a man who was on trial and was convicted of the murders of Elizabeth Griffith and Stacey Stanley, as well as the abduction of Miss Stanley. He was also on trial for the abduction and rape of a third unidentified woman, a woman who's only been identified as Jane Doe. After that really powerful and emotional trial, the same jury that convicted him now has to determine what his punishment will be. And he could face not just life in prison without the possibility of parole, which is one of the options, but a greater option is the death penalty. That's right, aggravated murder means that Shawn Grate could be sentenced to death. What the defense is doing right now in the sentencing part of the sentencing phase of this case is presenting any kind of mitigating circumstances, any kind of way to get sympathy from the jury and say, you know what, my client, he doesn't deserve to be killed. Maybe he deserves life in prison. Maybe he deserves 30 years in prison, 25 years in prison. That is what the options are for the jury. On the stand right now is the defendant's sister. She's been testifying so far since the beginning of the program, talking about their upbringing, talking about the troubles, the issues that Mr. Grate suffered as a young child, coming not from a loving family, all of these kinds of issues. Right now, she's under cross-examination by the state, and the state is poking holes in her testimony. Let's go live. Welcome back to Law and Crime, everybody. I'm your host, Jesse Weber. What are we learning? We're learning a little bit more about the defendant, Shawn Grate, in his sentencing hearing. Remember, he was convicted of 2 counts of aggravated murder in the connection with the deaths of Elizabeth Griffith and Stacey Stanley, as well as abducting and raping a third woman who's been identified as Jane Doe. During this sentencing hearing, where the death penalty is on the table, the defense has presented Barbara Charter, the defendant's sister, trying to explain a little bit more about Shawn Grate's upbringing and trying to garner some sympathy. Well, under cross-examination by the prosecution, he really is pointing to the fact that when Shawn doesn't get his way, he acts up, he gets violent. I want to bring back in Yosha Gunasekera. Yosha, I know our time together is coming to an end. What do you make of this testimony under cross?
You have to wonder if it's doing more harm than good for the defense. Nothing that she said has been especially compelling. I was expecting a little bit more. We didn't get it. And then the prosecution really capitalized on the fact that he is temperamental, gets angry very quickly, and potentially is violent.
Not even potentially anymore. He was convicted of murdering 2 women, but you see how it's interesting it's really interesting to hear how he started out and where he is today. Yosha, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate your insight into this case.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, everybody, let's go back live into the courtroom. This is the Shawn Grate case out of Ohio.